so much healing in forgiving other people.
Yes.
And even, yeah, there's so much that could be said about that. I could preach a sermon right now.
Right. Well, and I think what's really cool too is, and part of the reason why, I mean, it took me years. I think the first time I actually spoke about it like online was 2 to 3 years ago. Well, maybe five. I think it was right after Calvin was born. Um, but I was so nervous, and I even got some backlash from my mother because
I've
of
heard
things that
that.
I said. And um, so it took me some time to start talking about it. And what's really funny is that, when I started talking about it, people in Texas were like, what? Because, we moved away so that I wouldn't have to be Tamika Marchbanks anymore, that I
Yeah.
could be um, Tamika Taylor and not the sum of the trauma that happened to me. Right. Welcome back to Say More Words. I'm your hostess with the mostest, Tamika Taylor, and I have one of the most important people in my life as a special guest today. So I'm so very excited to introduce you to Jim Page. But before I do that, Jim, will you tell us what the song of the day is?
My song of the day is Mercy by Elevation Worship.
Mm, it's such a good one.
Had you heard it before?
Yeah. Yeah, it's
Really?
actually on my worship playlist.
Oh, it's an amazing song.
Yeah. Yeah.
Amazing.
I love it. Well, y'all, it is a very special occasion. Because not only is Jim a very special guest, but he's a special guest during a very special week. And so when this podcast is airing, it is March 27th, which is a Wednesday, March 27th, 2024. And that means that in 2 days is mine and Jim's anniversary. And we have a very interesting anniversary because God gave us each other in a very dramatic way. I like to tell people you are the most dramatic relationship I've ever gotten to be a part of, or I got introduced to. And so, for you, those of you who are listening, if you have not listened to episode 11 yet of the podcast, that is Finding the Joy in My Trauma. And Jim plays a very important role in that because Jim is the police officer who saved my life. And so, we have a very unique relationship, Jim and I. And I think it's a relationship that not many people get to have or even seek out because of the experience that the two of us went through. Jim is a retired police officer for the state of Wisconsin, and I can't speak on your behalf. I'm not a police officer, but I can only imagine that you've helped a lot of people. You've saved people. You've done things before, but not every police officer gets to have the experience and the relationship we get to have, and that had to be fostered. And that's part of the reason why Jim is here today, because we wanted to talk about. We got to have breakfast recently, the two of us, and we got to sit and have a conversation that was like 14 years waiting, right? It was like that
Right.
healed conversation. And so, Jim, if you would like to introduce yourself, tell them a little bit about you.
Okay. Tamika, you're absolutely right. I've never had a relationship start with the fireworks that this one did, and I am so blessed to have it. Um, I am a retired police officer. I'm a father of 5 sons, recently widowed a couple years ago, from Angela, an amazing woman who you were blessed enough to meet.
Yeah.
Um, the call that we're going to talk about with your father was the beginning of the end of my career, and ultimately it turned out to be a blessing. Very fortunate to be able to retire when I did. Um, but that's really it. What I really want to discuss today when we wrap this up is just the incredible steps that you've taken, that I've taken to get to where we are, to where you and I are both helping people in different realms, but um, still using that trauma to help. And just so you know, you have blessed me with this podcast. I listened to your Joy Through Trauma a couple weeks ago, and it fell right in line with so many other things that were happening. Um, and I hope to get to that a little bit today too on how you've blessed me.
Yeah. So I'm going to give, if you, well, I advise you all to go back to listen to episode 11. In a very dramatic event, my parents were having an extreme fallout in their divorce that led to stabbings and the house being on fire and police from all over, because I lived in a really small town of about 4,000 people. And so Jim was not even a police officer in my town. He was from the town over, coming to our rescue. And it was a very big deal in our small town. There was 4,000 in my town. I think in Jim's town was about 10,000, and then like the whole area itself was like 60,000 people. So everybody was talking about it. And as you can imagine, very traumatic event for both Jim and I, two different perspectives. And we had the opportunity to meet in court, and actually I have our anniversary, like our original anniversary is March 29th, but our like the first time we met was in court testifying against my dad together. We were the only two to testify against him, which I think also creates a really strong bond, because we're like, well, this fucking sucks.
Absolutely.
This is not the best experience. But we I I don't want to speak for you, but for me, I think it was truly the day, Jim, where we both realized like our PTSD from this event was huge. Like there was no amount of therapy that was fixing it at that point. And we were both like, one of the things that people don't realize with trauma is that it's the stages of grief over and over and over and over
Absolutely.
again. And there was a point, the point where we became friends, and you may not know this, I don't think I've ever told you this, was at the point when I was so mad. Like I
At,
was just mad at everything, not like at
sure,
you, but just like
sure.
at the situation that we had to experience it, that, I didn't have parents anymore. It's just like that stage of just intense grief. And so it was just anger. Like I went past sad and I was just sitting in anger for so long.
I get that. And I don't know if you know this. Within a few days, okay, so the shooting happened on March 29th, and it took a while for the district attorney to clear me of the shooting. And all I wanted to do is get back on the road. I wanted to prove that I was okay, even though I knew I wasn't. But
Mm-hmm.
my goal was to hide the pain that I was going through and just get back on the road. And as soon as I did, as soon as I got back on the road, and it was like a week and a half, 2 weeks after the shooting, um, I called your mom. I don't know if you knew that.
I did not.
I called her, and um, so you're going to see this old retired SWAT officer get pretty emotional a few times today. Um, I called her, and I didn't need her approval or her acceptance or forgiveness. I really wanted it though.
Mm-hmm.
And I introduced myself as, I mean, I'm Jim Page. I'm the officer that shot Keith, you
Mm-hmm.
know, and the phone was silent for a few seconds. And I believe one of the first things she said was, I don't blame you.
Mm.
And that 4 words did so much to heal me. And I know there
Mm.
have been issues after that, but we actually met, Angela and I and Tyler met your mom and your Aunt Dawn, I believe, Dawn,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
for dinner a few days later. And we
Okay.
talked about a lot of this. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I was still, so right after the shooting, I was pretty elevated. I mean,
Yeah.
I was so amped up, and something that I thought would never happen to me happened. And I didn't know what effect it was going to have on my entire life.
Yeah.
I've only seen it on TV. I've been through scenarios at training, but until it actually happens, it's a whole lot different.
Yeah.
And I was pretty elevated. I didn't sleep for a while, and then I was sad. I was raised Catholic, and the thought, because the first 2 days we weren't sure if your dad was going to live.
Mm-hmm.
And I wrestled with, you know, thou shalt not kill. And I got some spiritual clarity on that. Um, but then, yeah, the anger, the anger
Mm-hmm.
set in, and it came, the anger really festered. I, so I was on the road again for a while, and I had taken a complaint when I first got back on the road. It was a simple identity theft, and I didn't think anything of it. I shouldn't have been my call. It was lacrosse's. Anyway, the end of June, I'm in a bicycle race. I used to do a lot of racing, and um, it's 3 laps around this place called Bryce Prairie. In the first lap, I was feeling pretty good. Second lap, I started to get angry about
Mm-hmm.
everything that changed in my life. I had a then fourth grader who was making suicidal statements. Um, Stress at work, stress at home, um, just all of it. Just I couldn't reconcile with myself what had happened. By the third lap on that race, it's a 25-mile race. I was crying. I was so angry. I was crying, and got back to the park where they were having this thing, and they had a silent auction, and I'm bidding against this woman for an item, and we're going back and forth and back and forth, and it's something I could have just gone out and purchased, but I was going to prove a point, and they closed bids. This woman looked at me, smiled, and wrote down her last bid after they closed the bid. And all I could think of, excuse my language, but you bitch.
Yep.
And I took my bike to my truck, threw it in, and in the mood I was in, I should not have gone to work. But I did. And when I got there, this guy that from the complaint that I had taken earlier called me, and he just chewed me out one side and down the other. Just terrible.
Mm-hmm.
And the squad room's full of first shift people, second shift people. The assistant chief was there, who was a good friend of mine. Um, and normally you just listen, let it go, whatever. I couldn't let it go.
Yeah.
This guy just kept going and going and going. I said, you know what? I just effing shot someone, and you're complaining about $300. And pretty soon the phone was taken out of my hand, and I started crying in front of all these people, the ones that had trained me when I got hired, and the ones I trained. I was a field training officer, and I couldn't stop. And that was the end of June. I didn't work again until January. That's when I was diagnosed, and that's when my entire world changed. It's everything changed because I didn't have a choice then.
Mm-hmm.
Everything came out. The anger, the sadness. Um, there's just so many emotions that came out during that time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I I think one of the most powerful parts of you is that, and one of the parts that really sucks, one of the things that you discovered was that in law enforcement and EMTs, they go through PTSD just like military people do. And it's wild to me because it was just only 14 years ago. But PTSD was truly only considered for military. Like when they put me into a PTSD study post the event, they're like, well, typically this is only used for military, but we'll see if this can help you. And I'm like, well, that was a traumatic event. Can like I am post it, please fix it. Like,
Yes,
and
yes.
so we had to fight for that. And one of the things I'm so very proud of you, and I know it was a fight, and I know that, it's the call that ended your career, and that the anger, the sadness, the emotions, all of the things that you had to work through, one of the most beautiful things that was done from it is the fight that you did with the state of Wisconsin.
Yes.
Because there's nothing more infuriating than the fact that you weren't supported, but now because you fought for it, like that's one of the, like one of our main concepts in our relationship we realized this year is that we went from victim, 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 victim to be like, oh, okay, this
Enough.
had to happen so that we could be like it didn't have to happen. It didn't have to happen in the way that it did, but because it happened, we get to help people. And so you fought the state of Wisconsin for PTSD rights for police officers and EMTs. And tell us a little bit about how that went down.
Yeah, so I talked with the extensively with the president of the Wisconsin Law Enforcement Union
Yeah.
um, about this, and I called my insurance company because I was without income. I mean, I only had so much vacation and PTO built up, and I didn't have an income. And I called my insurance company and explained the situation to them. And I still remember the woman's name, Mary, spelled like Merry Christmas.
Yeah.
And um, I told her that this man came at me with a knife and that I had to shoot him. He was 10 feet away from me. There was no doubt he was going to stab me. And she gave her condolences and said, if you had let him stab you, we could have covered you. And I said, you cannot be serious. I said, please, please repeat that to my wife. And she did. Um, but she said, since we can't see your injury, we can't cover it. And I said, I know how to read case law and I've read the case law. It's a 1974 case. It's not that you can't cover it, you're choosing not to.
You're choosing not to. Yeah.
And, she debated that with me, but my case, along with several others, got enough statewide attention that the pressure was put on the insurance companies. And finally, and I forget his name, a representative in the Green Bay area introduced legislation to finally get coverage
Mm.
for for PTSD for emergency services. And right now it's police and fire, possibly paramedics. So I'm assuming they're going to continue working, for EMTs and such too. Um, but yeah, Angela and I got to go to the Capitol and um, talk to the representatives and lobby for this bill. And it was an incredible experience. And then to see it come to fruition was incredible. Just the feeling of it didn't help my case other than my healing, which is so much more important. But
Mm-hmm.
people moving forward and their concern was, and it makes sense. I don't agree with it, but I understand
Right.
it. Was that all these cops and firefighters were just going to retire and live off the
Oh,
state, and that hasn't been the case at all. I mean, I would still be working if I could be. This isn't
yeah.
what I wanted for myself, but it certainly has been a benefit to me.
Mm-hmm. What do you think? Well, one, I want to go back to grew up Catholic. And so, thou shalt not kill, but
Yeah.
also protect and serve. I think one of the coolest parts about our relationship too is that our faith changed and almost
Well,
in alignment, whether we didn't really talk about it, but you saw it. Like,
yeah.
you know, we, I think one of the hardest parts about when something very dramatic, I just keep telling people, I'm like, it was just very dramatic. It's a very dramatic thing. Something very dramatic happens, we can get into this space of like, why us? Why did this have to happen to me? Like, why did this have to happen to my family? Why, like, all of this, like, just doubt, shame, blame, guilt, resentment, just over and over and over. And I don't know about for you, but when I found a little bit of faith and a little bit of belief, and I got into this space of like, do I believe that God wants bad things to happen to people? No. But do I believe that he wanted us to do something with it? 100%.
Absolutely. And when I look, so I'm dating a fantastic woman right now. Her name is Nancy, and we were driving to Chicago a couple weeks ago, and I talked to you that day.
Yeah.
And we listened to that episode 11 of your podcast. And there's a lot that goes into that, and I will get back to the faith thing
Yeah.
because that is so important to me.
Yeah.
Um, I'm going to take a step back a little bit. Nancy and I were on a mission trip to Panama recently.
Yeah.
And when we were flying from Panama City to Chicago, I was just kind of ornery. And for whatever reason, I don't know why, She was sitting a few rows behind me. She walked up, tapped me on the shoulder, and whispered in my ear, "Choose joy." I was like, "Well, that I didn't know you could choose joy." so, so
That's an
I
option.
pondered that. Yeah, so, you know, I pondered that for a while, and I thought that was just amazing. Then a couple weeks later, my pastor Shane at First Free Church in Alaska here um, gave a sermon about staying, basically synopsizing it, staying in victimhood, not
Mm,
allowing yourself to heal, using resources you really don't need to use. And it's not like he's saying don't use them, but if you don't need them, don't use them.
yeah.
And I sat there thinking, with this anniversary approaching, I was like, that kind of makes sense to me. I could see how I've done that. Um, and then driving to Chicago to see Elevation Worship, actually, um, we listened to your podcast, and you were talking about choosing joy. And Nancy and I both, we looked at each other and we're like, man, it's just the puzzle just kept falling, the pieces just kept falling into place.
Yeah.
And we got done listening to it, and I don't know why I wasn't expecting to hear my name, but you brought it up a couple times, and I got emotional about it because I still do. Um, and she goes, "How are you feeling?" And I said, I want to talk to Tamika." And she said, "Call her." I was like, "Well, I can do that too. I can choose joy. I can call Tamika. I can do
Right.
whatever I want. I'm
Right.
retired.
Yeah.
I'm my own man."
Yeah.
Um, so I got to call you and talk to you and just tell you how proud of you I am. You know, I know I've told you before that you are like a daughter to me. I look at you and your sisters, and I love you. And it's it's so cool because I have 5 sons. So, kind of have a daughter in my life
Yeah.
now.
Yeah.
Um, but I'll get back to the faith here now. So, yeah, I had a 5 year span from the time of that shooting until the time I finally walked into church. And coincidentally, I walked into church on the anniversary of the shooting,
Mm,
5 years to the day. So during that 5 years, I was angry. Oh man, was I angry? I was short with my family. I was short with my people at work. Um, and I was not right. I wasn't centered, and just not who I normally was. And I just remember thinking that I was the sum of the traumas I had
mm,
been involved in. That the case that we're talking about, and other, I mean, that wasn't the worst call I've ever had. That was like match being set to kindling. I mean, that was
mhm,
just something had to happen. That was the call that did it, and it just blew up.
mm,
And all these emotions came out. Um, we had a friend of ours for years that just kept saying, "We'll save you a seat. We'll save you a seat at church." Never did it. Never did it. And it got to the point where I, I always say I was never suicidal.
mhm,
But I flirted with the ideation of it. And when I was at work, I would take the bad calls if I could, because I didn't want anybody else to end up like I was. Plus, if I got killed in the line of duty, my kids went to school for free,
mm,
college. So to me, that made sense.
right.
I obviously wasn't thinking as clearly as I should have. Um, joined the SWAT team, things like that. And I remember it was March 29th, 2015, and I was in a bad, dark place. And it was either a Saturday or Sunday. I don't recall which. And I looked at my wife and I said, if I don't do something, something's going to happen. Those were pretty much the exact words I said. Said, I've got to go to church or something. I knew I walked away from the Catholic faith years ago for various reasons. The church that I walked into that day is an evangelical, and they preach right out of the Bible. And I had not been to a service there. And growing up Catholic, I expected similar. I was
Yeah.
way off. I walked
It's very different.
I walked in and church is being held in a gymnasium in this church,
Yeah.
and the pastor's wearing jeans and a Harley shirt. He's a bodybuilder, and the worship music, Tamika, was I grew up with hymns and I love hymns, but
Yeah.
this rock music that and I was a metalhead from years ago, and I loved the worship music, and then Shane started to preach, and I knew nothing about the Bible.
Mm,
But I remember that day he was preaching on Ephesians 6, which is the full armor of God.
mm,
I was like, full armor of God. I was like, well, that makes sense to me. I can get that.
yeah.
Um, and then he mentioned he grew up in the Madison, Wisconsin area. He mentioned that he had been a police officer for a while. And I looked at Angela and I said, we're home.
Yeah.
This is where we need to be. So we continued to go to church there, and then I was still working. And in July of that year, July 8th, um, found out that a guy I went to high school with and who was a sergeant with the sheriff's department took his own life that night. Um, and that was really hard to take. He had, and the only reason I'm saying how he did it is because it plays a role in why I left the job. He shot himself,
Mm,
and I had known JJ for decades at that point,
mhm,
and I absorbed that. I stayed working that day, and then the next morning I get sent to a call where an elderly man had fallen down. And when I got there, he hadn't fallen, he had shot himself in the head.
mm,
And the scene that I and everybody else witnessed that morning was incredibly graphic. And as I'm picking up pieces of him, I'm thinking, what in the hell am I doing?
mm,
I'm damaging my family, damaging myself. Um, Even though I had God back in my life, it wasn't solid yet.
mhm.
And I remember walking up to my sergeant, and this was early in the day. I said, I'm going to do my report, and now I'm going to go home for the day. And that was the last shift I worked.
Mm,
Um, I talked to my wife about the call and about what happened to JJ the day before, and I said, I just can't do it anymore.
yeah.
Um, and it was at that point that my faith started to really grow. And
Mhm,
during that 5 year period and a couple after that, I went through counselor after counselor after counselor. I was put on various medications, and I got some relief from a therapy called EMDR,
yeah.
um, but not much. It wasn't, and I know this isn't a Christian podcast, but
Yeah.
if I don't say this, it's not true to who I am. It
Yeah.
wasn't until I found Christ that I got
Mhm,
relief.
mhm,
I still struggle, but I can turn to God. I can turn to myriad of people in my church. Um,
mhm.
it's been such a blessing to have that, because that is what made me whole again.
Yeah.
That's what made it okay um, that I wasn't working that job I absolutely loved. That um, that I was free of it, and it
Mhm,
ultimately turned out to be a blessing. Angela got sick, and I've got a son with profound disabilities who was sick on and off, and I was caretaker for them.
yeah.
And had I not been able to retire, I would have had to quit my job. So ultimately, I did get disability through the state after
Yeah.
all the court proceedings and everything.
Yeah.
So that paid off. Um, but yeah, it made it possible for me to care for my wife up until
Mhm.
she passed away.
Yeah, that goes along with, one of my friends always says, like, God's redirection, like, you have to lean into the redirection, and sometimes we don't like, sometimes we go out kicking and screaming and fighting, and we're like, "This is what I wanted to do, and this is who I was supposed to be, and this is what my life was supposed to look like," and the redirection, that's, I think, one of the things we talked about at breakfast is, like, the redirection in all of this, right? The redirection in the last 14 years, like there were parts that hurt really bad and parts that we had to struggle through, but the redirection, like it always did get better. It may have sucked, but at some point we could breathe again or we could move. And one of the things that I had, I think we talked about this, is that after everything happened with me, I didn't grow up in faith. Like my grandma was Catholic and she would take us to church, but my mom didn't appreciate that. And so I didn't really grow up in faith. But I had, after everything happened with us, that night, somebody at school, at college, I went back to visit and he was like, God really wanted this to happen to you. And I was like, well, excuse my French, but you can fuck right off. Why would you ever say that to somebody? And now, as someone who is healed and I found my faith, and I've found this place of, extreme joy in all of it. I can say, like, saying that God wanted it to happen. I think that's a bit dramatic, but I think that He wanted a redirection. There was a redirection that needed to happen. Things that needed to happen to have the life that I'm having now, um, and that goes kind of along with getting out of victimhood. Like you and I talked, we had to eventually, just like Pastor Shane said, like you have to release the victim
Right.
to become the victor, to find the space where, it doesn't hurt so much. But to the point that you made, that's very important for people to understand. Just because you heal, it doesn't mean it's always healed.
Mhm. That's right. And that's one of the things I was actually going to bring up
Yeah.
that because in your last podcast, I remember you saying somebody told you that God wanted this to happen. He didn't. That's free will.
Yeah.
Free will. It just like all the bad things. That's free will.
Yeah.
But God has certainly used it. He's used
Yes.
it in me. He's used it in you, and He's used it in other people. Um, and it's a beautiful thing when you can heal. You can heal from that pain. Um,
Hmm.
I look at how far you've come and how far I've come in this, and I refuse to allow this shooting or any of the other traumas to be who I am anymore. And then years ago, there's another pastor, John Reiner, that um, has walked me through parts of this.
Hmm.
And I was really struggling with this one night, and Angela asked him if he'd pray for me. And even if you look on my Facebook profile, it's written in one of the quotes there. And he's praying for me, and he said, Jim, you need to know that you are not this shooting. You are not these suicides you've seen. You're not whatever calls they are. You are not. You are just Jim the guy. And
Hmm.
that's what's written on my Facebook profile. And that's, and I absorbed that night. I thought about it. I was like, yeah, I am just Jim the guy. But that didn't stick until just recently, that I don't have to be the sum of these things that happen to me. I don't have to live my life like that. I'm able to talk about this freely. I have no issue with that at all.
Yeah.
And my wife Angela, God bless her, an amazing woman. But
Yes.
when these anniversaries would come up, she made such a big deal of them. And I would start just getting anxious and anxious and anxious. And I found that this year didn't happen. Last year I was doing well until you wrote the poem and destroyed me during my workout. But you're talking about trauma and being recovered from it, and
Yeah.
sometimes you have to reevaluate and go back in and fix some more. It's like
Yeah.
forgiveness. I was so angry with your dad for what he had done to my life,
Mm-hmm.
and I got to the point where I could forgive him,
Yeah.
but it wasn't one and done. It
Yeah.
was I had to forgive Keith multiple times, multiple times, multiple times, and then I realized one day, I was like, I haven't had to deal with that in months. I was like, I'm good.
Yeah.
I'm good. I, tr- I pray for your dad so often.
Thank
I
you.
pray for him. I, I look forward to hopefully meeting him someday.
Yeah.
because 15 minutes of his life have kind of been an identity for him, and that's not fair.
Mhm.
That is not fair. He's much more than the sum of this call.
Mhm.
And when my faith changed, when my understanding of trauma changed, my understanding of your dad changed.
Mm.
And I hold no ill will towards that man at all.
Yeah.
None. Um, I hope, I hope someday I can meet him.
You will. You will. I think that's one of the the interesting parts of our journey too is that, out of all of the people involved, we're the two. It's funny. We've been like the key players, right? Out of all the
Yeah.
people involved, we're the only ones that testified, and we're the only ones that reached back out to him. And I think that speaks a lot to the healing that we've done. That's different than maybe others that were involved. But there's this. Um, I will credit the situation and him and all of that to like the profound awareness of what forgiveness and healing can do for
Oh,
somebody.
absolutely, Tamika. That's very true. Very true. I wouldn't have the faith I have right now if it wasn't for that incident.
Yeah.
Um, like I said, that it was his free will that did it, but it was
Yeah.
God that brought us closer to him.
Mm-hmm. And
And
directed
there's,
us.
you know, the teaching pastors in my church use this quote frequently. Unforgiveness is like drinking poison and expecting it to kill the other person.
Mm.
And it's very true. That
Mm-hmm.
not speaking just about your dad, but being angry with other people. It does
Yeah.
no good. You're
Mm-mm.
carrying weight that you're not meant to carry. You know,
Mm-hmm.
there's so much healing in forgiving other people,
Yes.
and even yeah, there's so much that could be said about that. I could preach a sermon right now.
Right. Well, and I think what's really cool too is, and part of the reason why, I mean, it took me years. I think the first time I actually spoke about it like online was 2 to 3 years ago. Maybe 5. I think it was right after Calvin was born. Um, but I was so nervous, and I even got some backlash from my mother because
I
of
heard
things that
that.
I said. And um, so it took me some time to start talking about it. And what's really funny is that, when I started talking about it, people in Texas were like, "What?" Because, we moved away so that I wouldn't have to be Tamika Marchbanks anymore, that I
Yeah,
could be um, Tamika Taylor and not the sum of the trauma that happened to me.
right.
So I
That's a,
started talking about it. And then I don't know why the day that I recorded the Finding the Joy in My Trauma podcast happened, but it did. And that is my most shared episode. It is the most, like, because my analytics can see if it's shared via text message, if it's shared via
sure.
social media. It's my most shared. It is one of my most viewed. And it is the one that people come to me that say healed them the most. Whether, like, most people can't be like, oh, yeah, that exact story happened to me. Um, but inside of it, finally coming to the place where I could talk about it in a healed fashion showed other people that they can start or they can heal from whatever was holding them back. They're like, if you could survive that and also do all the things you're doing, why can't I? And that's why I think it's so very important. When we had breakfast, I talked about it. Like, it's so very important for us to kind of talk about this because, they may not be a police officer who shot somebody, but maybe they saw something, or maybe
Yeah,
they were involved in something, or like maybe they have a criminal past and that's trauma filled and they've healed from it. Like, the main point of this podcast is, one, to say more words, but to share the story so that other people could say, hey, me too, and use what you've done to move past it. And not even move past it, it doesn't ever go away. It's just, now it's not like a burning pile of shit in the corner that's always there. Now it's just a picture that's on the mantle and we know it happened and it existed, and now we can say I'm so thankful for changing me, as opposed to being like, why did you ruin me? And
Right.
so
Well, it's a huge part of who each of us are, but it's not
who
the
we are.
part. I mean, it's a huge part for me
Yeah.
because of what it did for my faith.
Yes.
And I've been able to speak at colleges and academies and officer involved shooting panels and answer questions about PTSD because men in general and emergency services in general don't like to talk about trauma,
Mm-mm.
because it shows weakness, and that is so wrong. Oh my goodness,
Mm-hmm.
people die because of that. People are
Yep.
killing themselves because of it. And if we don't recover out loud, what good is it?
Yeah.
What good is it? There is so much hope in recovery. There's so much hope in speaking about what has happened to you.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that it's not fair to other people. It's not fair to other police officers if I just keep this to myself
Yeah.
and people can't learn from it. It's not fair to other women like yourself if you don't speak about what happened to you.
Mm-hmm.
There's so much hope out there. And you look at the two of us in our recovery, and yeah, the story is unique. How we met is unique, but the recovery is available for absolutely everybody. It's not going to look the same. Um, I can say that with confidence that Christ is going to help you.
Yeah.
There's no way Christ won't help you. But
Mm-hmm.
there are other things. There are medications. There is counseling. But never give up hope on recovering from trauma.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the, I mean, that's one of the best messages. And I think that's, part of the reason why I talk about it, why I wanted to have you here, is because I want people to see that there's hope, and that I think together, you've been doing it, I've been doing it, and together we can help others find that hope, experience a little bit of hope, and then also heal. I think it's a very powerful thing that once it's that once you have the roadmap, and even though we're not ever fully healed, we're a lot further down on the roadmap than most people. And so now we can look back and be like, hey, come on, you could do it.
Yep,
Like, jump on, get here.
yep,
We'll hold your hand through it. Especially for police officers and EMTs. And I mean, really anybody that experiences trauma. But I think definitely inside of your field of work, they don't talk about it.
right. It's getting better.
It's good.
Finally, it
Good.
is.
Good. Well, you're part of that revolution, and I'm very proud of you for being a part of that, because it's huge. It is it is huge. And as like somebody who is wildly obsessed with police officers and has multiple friends who are police officers, and some of them going through really hard times right now, I'm very
Yeah,
thankful for the work that you've done to help rally and support them, um, because it matters. It really does.
yeah, it
It
does.
does. Well, Jim, I am so very thankful that we can have the conversations that we have the relationship that we have, and that even though you're the most dramatic way that God has given me somebody, I would do it again and again just to get to experience life with you. I am thankful that I get to live today because you exist, and that you get to live today because I exist, and that um, together we can heal people. So I appreciate you doing really hard things, and coming on the podcast and starting the conversation and doing it publicly, and not being afraid to call and talk to me about really hard things, and for just the family that I have in you. I'm so very thankful.
So am I. So am I. I look at what you've done with your life, your beautiful family, and I know every day you have to choose joy,
Mm,
but you do it.
amen.
And anybody can choose it. It's not always going to be roses and butterflies or whatever, but that
Yeah.
hope is out there. And
Hmm.
watching what you've done with your life has been just beautiful. And I'm so very thankful to be in it.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Well, Jim, I don't think this is going to be the last time that you get to be here in this space. And now I have all of the thoughts about, we need to start calling some of these panels and doing our things together, because how powerful would it be to be speaking
I'm
in a
in.
panel
You tell me
with,
when and where.
all right, we're going to figure that out. I feel like that's That's some juicy goodness that we could bring to people's life. Well, thank you for being here. Happy March 29th day. Happy Me Day. Happy the day that we got to meet. And I am so excited to bring joy to ourselves this week, as opposed to being like, well, oh shit, here we go. And I promise not to make you cry this time.
Well, that's going to come up on my Facebook memories. I'm going to
Oh
see
yeah.
it. It's going to be a whole thing.
It's going to be a whole thing. It's a whole cycle. It's a whole cycle. Maybe I'll put the poem in the show notes so you all can cry too. It's a
Oh,
good
there
one.
you go. That's a great idea.
That is a good idea. Well, Jim, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate you being here.
Oh, thank you, Tamika. Have a great day.
You too.
Bye.